Well, hello there, and welcome to this, the 185th edition of DF Direct Weekly, our weekly show where generally we tend to discuss the latest gaming and technology news. As usual, lots to get through this week. On the panel this week, Oliver Mackenzie, hello.
Yes, Rich, here for the 185th time. it's Oliver Mackenzie.
Not including specials.
Not including specials.
Yes, and John Linneman.
Hey guys, good to be here. I'm still flanked by CRTs, as viewers can see. If you're listening to the audio version, just imagine some large CRTs behind me.
Okay. As I said, lots to get through this week. But of course, before we do that, shout outs to store.digitalfoundry.net. Examine in great depth our merchandising wares and consider a purchase if you fancy supporting the team. But with that, let's move on to our first news topic. Okay, so we're going to kick off with some Xbox news. Obviously, there was the partner showcase. We'll get to that shortly. But what we're going to be talking about right now is a video produced by Austin Evans. He was sent by Microsoft all of the new Xbox consoles, or specifically the new Series X consoles. That would be the all-white Xbox Series X that has the disk drive strategically removed. And then there's the 2 terabyte model, which has a nice sparkly new case. Now, in theory, looking at these devices, not much has really changed, right? If you think back to the FTC leak, we had the adorably all-digital sort of trash can-shaped Xbox. Thankfully, that appears to be like an alternate timeline that never happened. Instead, we have these machines, which are basically variations of a theme. Now, Austin's video was interesting because he actually took them apart, or more specifically, took the all-digital version apart. There was much hilarity and whooping where he discovered that the missing space for the optical drive was indeed a missing space. I'm not quite sure what they're expecting. But more interesting was the fact that the main boards have completely changed, and we now have a 6-nanometer processor at the heart of the machine, along with pared back cooling. Oliver, did you see that video? What do you think of it?
I did. My first impression is finally, because Sony was shipping 6-nanometer processors in their consoles 2 years ago. But yep. I guess my kind of second thought was that I guess this is the part of the Brooklyn refresh that we saw last year that actually did make it to market. This is like the minimum viable product Brooklyn refresh, because you get the lower power consumption, you get a 6-nanometer processor, you get a motherboard redesign, you also get a revised thermal assembly, it seems like here. But the actual external design of the unit is identical to before, unless of course you get that disk driveless unit, which does look very slightly different, obviously. But I think it's basically the compelling parts of the Brooklyn upgrade from our perspective are there. And as a bonus, they haven't discontinued the disk drive model, which we were concerned about with the Brooklyn refresh because they did not enumerate plans for a disk drive equipped Brooklyn model. And we don't even know if it would have been possible based off the internal layout, right? It might not have been possible to ship a true Brooklyn refresh console with a disk drive. And I think this design is probably a bit more practical because it's easier to stack them horizontally than the Brooklyn console indicated. Right now, the Series S fits just perfectly on top of the Series X back there, which is quite a nice little thing for our purposes, at least. But if anything, my only real kind of insight here is that I'm surprised it's taken Microsoft this long to revise the Series X, because the Series X is not a cheap console to make, and going to 6 nanometers, scaling back the heatsink as they appear to have done here, introducing a model without a disk drive for the Series X. Those are all things I would have expected earlier in the generation. They're all things that Sony did earlier in the generation. And it seems like if you combine that with some aggressive price cuts, you could have made maybe a bit more of an inroads into Sony's market share this generation. But it kind of seems like Microsoft's general approach with no enhanced console, cutting prices relatively rarely, not revising the console silicon, not revising the console hardware. Perhaps that reflects a level of comfort in their ability to hit consumers across multiple different platforms, or maybe it's just a lack of a willingness to throw a lot of money after market share as they've done in the past, and they kind of are resigned somewhat to this position in the market. I'm not quite sure what it means, but I think this upgrade overall, to me, it does seem a little bit overdue. I'm glad that they're doing it, and I'm glad that they are achieving some power consumption savings. I'm glad they are achieving some bill of materials, likely some bill of materials reductions. But it does seem to be coming a little bit late in the game, 4 years in, to have your first major console revision when Sony did it in like 2021 the first time around, right?
Yeah, there's been several revisions of the PlayStation 5. The first one retained the existing 7 nanometer processor, then they moved to 6 nanometer. Now they're doing a Pro model. There is constant revision there, and it's obviously been slightly slower paced on Xbox, where we've waited a couple of extra years. In fact, we got this question from Degenerative AI. Any idea why it took Microsoft almost 4 years to do a die shrink for the Series X compared to the circa 2 years it took Sony? I'd have thought it would have been a higher priority for them, given they had the more expensive die to begin with. That's a fair point, right? But I think the other thing to bear in mind is that we have practically zero visibility on cost of materials and bill of materials for the whole console. We don't really know exactly what the economic decision was and why it was made now rather than 2 years ago. I can only assume that there is a perfectly good reason for it. And if we look at the actual end product from both Sony and Microsoft, well, Sony actually took the opportunity to produce, to kind of refresh the whole thing, right? We had a smaller, slightly smaller, not that much smaller console. But clearly for Microsoft, it's been less of a priority. They decided not to use the 6 nanometer opportunity to actually produce, a revised console in the way that they did with Xbox One S. That's the thing. So I can only assume that we just don't have visibility on why that is the case. I mean, we often look at things and think, hey, 6 nanometer, it's going to be cheaper than 7 nanometer. It's obvious. Why aren't they doing it? Well, that's the thing. We just don't really know, but we must assume that Microsoft isn't just throwing money away for the sake of it. John, do you have any particular thoughts about this? Because I guess from your perspective, there's just not really much of interest here at all.
Well, there is. So obviously at one point they clearly had planned a refresh with a visual update to the hardware, and they opted not to go in that direction. But seeing this here, to me, makes me think that perhaps we are simply edging closer to whatever they have envisioned for the next generation. You know what I mean? Like maybe they found it not viable to actually, or worthwhile to produce a visually updated new version of the machine because they have other plans in the works that may hit sooner than we'd expect. Maybe. Okay. But beyond that, though, I would also say that less than the PlayStation 5, the original Xbox Series X design is actually quite good. It's really good, actually, I would say. It's a really nicely built machine, and one that I'm not sure necessarily needed a visual update. Whereas the original Xbox One was largely derided at the time of release, right? It was considered big, cheap, we call it the VCR for a reason. The Xbox One S gave the brand like a much needed sort of breath of fresh air, right? Where it was just an attractive design that would certainly help move additional units. And then they leveraged that for the Xbox One X, of course, following a similar design language. To me, this just feels like, well, this was not necessarily a priority in terms of like updating anything on this current Xbox. It was more like, I guess it just made sense to do 6 nanometer at some point and just keep that ball rolling. But I don't know, when I look at this, I just think they're really like they've got to be winding up for something else rather than continuing the Xbox Series line. Like I don't feel like Xbox Series is necessarily what they view as their future at this point. And I think they've resigned themselves to the fact that whatever's next is what they really want to take the big shot on.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, thinking back, I mean, I've met the Xbox sustainability team, or at least a couple of members of the sustainability team, and they're making genuine efforts to reduce power consumption. And they're doing it in software, basically, by for example, Fortnite has had dynamic resolution scaling bounds paired back simply because they couldn't really tell the difference, but you could tell the difference in terms of power consumption. And the concept that they would put out a 6 nanometer box, which would bring power consumption down. Well, according to Austin Evans here, who did a pretty good job on this. He measured the power consumption of the new unit versus the old unit, seeing the similar 10 to 15% power savings that the PlayStation 5 revision, 6 nanometer revision had. They didn't really say anything about it. It's kind of like a complete sort of mystery. It's only because Austin took the machine apart that we know about this at all. So that's slightly odd.
Power consumption, then I'm sure it was nothing. That was clearly the main focus, I'd say. Right.
Power consumption, and I'm assuming, as far as I'm aware, TSMC, the chip fabricator, they expected all of their 7-nanometer customers to move to 6-nanometer. Because I think it's the same wafer even.
Right. So
yeah, there is a bit of mystery surrounding this. We got this question from James Prendergast regarding the 6-nanometer Xbox Series APUs. I'm looking at the power savings, and they appear similar to the 10 to 15% that was seen for the PS5 1200 model. I'm a little surprised the power savings are so similar. I would expect a larger chip with a wider GPU would have greater savings than the PS5's APU. It has got lower clock speeds, though. That's something to bear in mind. That's probably the reason why. Yeah. I know that this change allows cost savings on each unit manufactured from Microsoft, but it's a little sad to think that they couldn't have instead boosted the CPU frequency by 100 to 200 megahertz or something similar. Fair point, but if you're going to differentiate the consoles, that probably creates more headaches for QA, that kind of thing, and also it means. Well, it's a lot of effort for something that's just not going to be noticed by the end user, typically.
Yeah, exactly.
In terms of the die conversation that degenerative AI was talking about, having a more expensive die to begin with, one thing that was lacking from the Austin Evans video was actually a die measurement for the new processor. But I did speak to Austin after the event, because in the video you can actually see him measuring it. He just doesn't give the measurement. So I did ask him for his measurements, and he measured the old SoC and the new SoC, and the dimensions for the old one were 22 by 9 millimeters versus by 16 by 6. That would give a die size of 380 square millimeters, but we actually know that the Series X's die size is 360. So it just goes to show how difficult it is to do a die measurement generally. How big is the package versus the actual logic. He also measured the new SoC, 20 mil by 16.5. So essentially very similar height, but it's kind of like being sort of drawn in on the X-axis. Now, if we actually assume that those measurements were taken in the same way by the same piece of equipment, and then look at the differential there and apply it to the official die size of the 7-nanometer chip, I would get a die size of the new model for about 312.5 millimeters square. But the actual measurement that Austin produced was 330. But yeah, applying the rules of the proportionate difference to the actual die size, you get 313. So hopefully that will give some answers to people. But yeah, curious thing. Austin didn't have a Series S to test, but I fully expect that has also had a die shrink as well. That was in the FTC document.
Makes sense.
And in the FTC document, the unit was exactly the same pretty much. So yeah, they seem to have adopted that strategy for the entire line. But it's an interesting point that you've got there, John, that, essentially they don't really see any kind of marketing win in producing a revised model. And maybe they are looking to bring forward the hardware, because the same FTC leak was talking about a 2028 launch. And to bring that forward would require quite a lot of effort.
Quite a lot of effort, indeed. The thing is, though, is when you look at what Sony did with the Slim, that ended up being kind of part of their master plan with the PS5 Pro, right? Where the detachable disk drive thing, the plates that can be used between the Pro and the Slim model, they were clearly basically setting up this slightly new design language with that unit to then roll it out to the Pro. So there was a real market purpose to it, where here I feel like it's pretty obvious this is as far as Xbox Series goes. It will end with these machines, and then whatever comes next will come next and be a different thing.
I think something else we should probably talk about, Oliver, is the price point. Obviously the FTC leak was talking about the adorably all digital Xbox Series X for the same great price.
Right.
But we're effectively looking at
that was for a 2 terabyte model. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's curious, isn't it? Obviously, that hasn't come to pass. The 2 terabyte machine is $600, which I think is, I think at this point, can we accuse Sony of overpricing the PS5 Pro if nobody is able to actually cost reduce the base models?
I think it's just the reality of modern economics with this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that Sony and Microsoft would both love to reduce the price of these machines, right? They're not doing this just out of pure greed, because this does have an effect on market share. But clearly there are other factors at work here that are preventing them from being able to lower this price to a reasonable level.
Yeah. I mean, I do think here that Sony is generally more aggressive with Microsoft in discounting their consoles at various points in the year.
A good point.
Quite heavily. And I think that $600 price for the 2 terabyte model, although that is $600 for a 2 terabyte model with a disk drive, so it isn't quite apples to apples there in terms of the comparison with Brooklyn. But certainly Brooklyn, just in its design language and what they were doing with it, and the same price for 2 terabytes, even without the disk drive, was a bit more of an aggressive push here. And yeah, I mean, I think there are kind of two ways you can go with console hardware this generation. You can kind of aggressively discount and lose margins, lose money in every console, or you can kind of keep the price the same and then raise it over time, which is not a great outcome either, right? So kind of a rock and a hard place there.
I will also say that the new 2 terabyte model, I'm not sure what to think of that sort of paint design, the Starfield looking design that they have going on. To me, it looks like somebody was doing painting around their living room and happened to splatter white paint all over their Xbox. You know what I mean? Like it's
right.
When you see the close-ups of it in Austin's video, it really does just like little paint blotches. It's a little strange.
Yeah, it's not particularly exciting, is it?
I would rather a white version of the disk drive Xbox Series X was available. I don't like that white seems to mean no disk drive in the Xbox lineup. I like
Xbox
white
design
consoles.
language.
Yeah. So
okay. I mean, I guess there is one other takeaway. When the FTC leak happened, I mean, it looked like this massive reveal of Microsoft's plans. Phil Spencer came out and said, well, those are the old plans.
he was
Don't
right.
pay them any mind. And I guess my reaction to that is, well, you know, to actually change direction so dramatically is a huge undertaking. I didn't quite believe that it would happen, but obviously it has. So
Yep.
there we go.
One final shout out though, I just want to say Austin Evans, super cool dude. We've gotten to talk to him many times. Very, very nice guy. Does awesome videos.
Yeah, so check out this video by all means if you haven't seen it, because, you know, obviously he did the heavy lifting here.
Sure did.
We weren't even sent a unit.
Nope.
Just quite amusing. Okay, with that, let's move on to the next topic. Okay, so yesterday, at the time of filming, Xbox revealed their latest partner showcase, which is, as the name heavily implies, just a showcase of games coming to Xbox, many of which I guess will be coming to other systems too. Lots of games there, plenty to wade through. And I guess, well, we could be here all day, but let's just choose maybe the top 5 that we that sort of caught our eye. Let's begin with FBC Firebreak from Remedy, which was the sort of one final thing at the end. This is looking quite cool. Remedy is producing a first-person co-op shooter. They're saying it's within the Control universe, but the Control universe is the Alan Wake universe, is it not? It's the Remedy universe. Even so, I'm not quite sure what to make of the gameplay, but John, what do you think of this?
Unexpected to say the least, I will say.
Yes.
Because this is something kind of outside of Remedy's usual wheelhouse.
Yeah.
But I will say that as someone that normally does not engage with these types of multiplayer shootery things so much anymore, conceptually speaking, this did at least capture my interest to some degree, where I got some of the mechanics they showed, like that what do you call that thing where he basically does like a rocket jump with it at one point. It's like a cement pounding thing. I don't know what you call it, but it was I was like, wait, is that like a rocket jump? That's really cool. It looks fun. It's got a cool aesthetic. And I kind of feel like Remedy always has like unique hooks to their games, which makes me think that this could stand out as something, again, somewhat different. But of course, every developer entering the multiplayer fray these days is faced with a significant challenge where if it does not catch on pretty much right away, it could spell doom for it. It's no longer all that feasible to launch just a straight multiplayer game and actually support it long term if it doesn't find that player base relatively quickly.
Well, they're pulling out the stops here by making it available on both Game Pass and PlayStation Plus at launch.
And I think that right there is probably a key factor here that might help its success. Because, this is like, when you look at something like Concord, for instance, beyond the fact that it wasn't very appealing, the fact that it was a game that you had to purchase first and then you get to play it, that is a gigantic barrier for a game like this, where when it's available on these services, it definitely encourages people to check it out, because like, oh, well, I'll just give this a shot and see how this is. And if it's good enough, maybe it'll actually hit. And I think that because of, you couple that with this unique Remedy aesthetic and some of the interesting things they have going on in here, and maybe it'll be a hit. I hope so for their sake.
Oliver, what do you think?
Yes. Well, I think it looks really great, actually. I like co-op shooters a lot more than competitive ones, typically in these multiplayer titles. And I think the scope is pretty reasonable, what they're doing here for a game like this. Like, they're talking about a mid-price game. Thomas Pua was kind of talking down on the idea that this is a live service title. It's not necessarily a live service title. They're aiming to basically get this out the door and have it be like a complete experience on day one that's not all about chasing loot in every single instance, right? And I'd like it if they approach this with some kind of single player component as well. Like, it could be played solo, because that's kind of the way that I tend to like to play these games sometimes, especially now that like my friends only seem to want to play Helldivers, so I'm pretty much stuck there in terms of a multiplayer squad. And one thing I liked here, though, is, like John said, the rocket boosting and like the really wide open environments and the very creative use of weapons and stuff like that. Like, it looks like a fun game to interact and play with, and not just like some pretty standard multiplayer zombies type shooter that we've seen so many times throughout the years. It looks like it's an interesting twist on the genre, and hopefully it'll be a successful title.
Well, I'll tell you what, I looked at the post-trailer PR, and one thing's just jumped out to me is that they don't expect you to be spending an hour tweaking your loadouts. And
oh, thank God.
Yes, because I just don't engage with that mechanic whatsoever. I just find it friction to actually getting into the 100%. Game and having some fun. But there's always the fear that if you don't do it, then you're going to be at a disadvantage.
I think the thing about that, Rich, is that everyone's doing it now. And so by being a game that doesn't do that, you automatically stand out.
Mm-hmm. I mean, all I can really say is go back and play the original Quake. It's still one of the greatest multiplayer shooting experiences of all time. And the reason why is that it's completely friction-free. And, you just jump in, have fun. That's all there is about it. In terms of what we're looking at here with FBC Firebreak, I mean, it's the Remedy Northlight engine. I'm expecting big things from that. What else could I say? I mean, I was sort of taken aback by some of the weapons there, which don't really seem like anything we've seen before in the Remedy-verse, but, it looks like fun. I was just thinking, based on what I saw there, what would a raw co-op experience for something like Control look like? I think that would be pretty awesome too. I mean, the thing about Remedy is that they've mastered gunplay, several times over. We've seen this sort of iteration. Quantum Break was pretty great in that regard.
Yeah, it was.
Same with Control. And to actually bring that into a co-op experience, and I think pretty much there's so much chaos going on here that PvP just wouldn't really work. So it's kind of got to be co-op. So what can I say? I think it's highly, highly promising. But let's move on. Kronos, the New Dawn. Unreal Engine 5, Bloober Team. There's not really... it was a cinematic, basically, wasn't it, John?
Yeah, basically a cinematic. Did they actually specify? Let me check here. If it was like... Because I noticed on this specific Xbox showcase, they did a better job of putting like cinematic and stuff at the bottom. But I'm not seeing that in the trailer for this, but...
No, it was in the show, but it wasn't in the
actual trailer. Right. Well, I guess the key here is I feel like Bloober Team has earned themselves some additional credibility thanks to Silent Hill 2, which was largely well received. I think most people think they did a good job on it. I'm still waiting for my copy to play it, but everything I've seen suggests that it turned out a lot better than expected. And it's a situation that makes me think about something like, like a Metroid Prime or something, where you have a Western studio teaming up with a Japanese company, like in this case, Konami and other creatives there. And I'm wondering if that has had like a positive influence on the way they approach their games. You know what I mean? And I'm curious to see where Bloober Team goes from here with their future projects. And Chronos has some thematic elements that I found very appealing. The sort of sci-fi stuff, which differs significantly from what they've mostly done. And I guess at the end of the trailer, they showed some gameplay bits here, it looks like.
Yeah.
Walking around in third person. And it looks suitably spooky and aesthetically interesting. I think it's set in a foggy environment, but what it actually called to mind was something like a combination of like The Abyss, the film, and Soma, the game, which was my favorite game from the creators of the
Amnesia, was it?
Yeah, I can't remember their name. Whatever, the Amnesia creators, the developers of Amnesia. I feel bad for forgetting their name, but Soma was my favorite game that they made, and part of that was just down to the atmosphere that they delivered here. And this looks to be tackling a similar type of thing, maybe, or it's with that mix of sci-fi and horror down pretty well. So I'm very curious to see what this turns into.
Are you referring to fictional games there, John?
Wow, I would have not pulled that out of my head. Frictional games, huh? Yeah, I haven't heard that name in a while.
Well, I pulled it out of Google.
Nice.
Oliver, thoughts?
Oh, I think this trailer is really something. I mean, just that slice of gameplay at the end, it's so brief, but it does give me big Dead Space vibes, like the way that he's holding that gun, or maybe something a little bit Resident Evil-y, where it's like this slightly slower paced game, hopefully with a bit more of an emphasis on action. Maybe some other prior Bloober Team joints. I think that's really cool. Tech-wise, I think this trailer might be at 24 FPS, or at least it's not super stable here.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so it's that's a little bit curious. It is a cinematic trailer, of course. Primarily, it is a cinematic trailer, and I mean the cinematic section looks absolutely incredible. But nowadays, with UE5 producing a cinematic trailer, you don't really want to read too much into that in terms of how the actual game will look and run. But the section of gameplay looks terrific too. I did notice some slight issues where maybe it looks like the VSM is going a bit awry on some of the smaller foliage elements there, but that's just a very, very minor thing here. I think, like John said, Bloober Team has established themselves as kind of a premier survival horror developer now with Silent Hill 2. It really is quite exciting stuff what they're doing. And I think, like Silent Hill 2, this will probably be a pretty terrific looking UE5 title in a lot of respects.
Yeah, absolutely. It does seem to be the case that Bloober Team have, basically been scaling up in their projects, moving from project to project, but just getting ever more ambitious, which I think is really, really cool. We've come a long way from The Medium and its prior titles there. So, looking forward to this one. John, you highlighted Blind Fire, which certainly looks interesting, right?
Yeah, so that one...
There is an early access review. It is on early access now, but we've not had the time to play it yet. But the trailer certainly looks great.
Yeah, that's the thing, is we can't really talk in detail about this despite it now arriving. But I thought conceptually, again, I have to say, these sorts of multiplayer shooters don't usually do it for me. But this is another instance where there is like this conceptual like idea behind this, where you're essentially fighting in the dark. That's the idea here. The map is very dark, and you're relying on, it looks like there's some scanning through your visor you can do to see certain objects, but it's largely very dark, and it relies on dynamic lights in the environment to sort of attack your foe, from what I can tell here. And I think that's neat. Like, we're not really seeing much in the way of like games that sort of leverage the environment in such a way. It reminds me a little bit of what they kind of hinted at with what Doom 3 multiplayers mode could have been back in the day, where it was just like dark areas with the flashlight and everything, but that was obviously still much more visible than this, where this is like straight up like pitch black with just like very subtle outlines, and you're like firing around in the dark. I think that's cool. That's all. So I'm actually curious to try it, just to see if I can actually jive with it. Just to, you know.
Another game which sort of stood out in terms of its originality was Mouse PI for Hire. John?
Oh, right. That was so cool. Oh my gosh. Yes. This is obviously going after a similar old cartoon style, not unlike, say, Cuphead. Seems to be no relation to that game, of course. But this is a first-person shooter with some detective elements in it seems. But what I love about it is that they've gone for this old-style black and white cartoon aesthetic, and while the world itself is done using normal 3D polygons, it seems like the weapons and the enemy characters are all done with sprites. But they're all fully animated and drawn in that old cartoon style. And it looks awesome in this case. But it also got me thinking more about, like, I'd love to see more games leverage sprites in this way, because the size and the number of frames of animation in here, this is all stuff that you could not have done prior, right? In the past, when sprite-based shooters were big, the memory and the fidelity just was not feasible, and now we can do these gigantic, super detailed character sprites, and I think that's really promising. So how this game will turn out, I don't know, but aesthetically it's really cool. And I think it was actually shown off like a while ago, like possibly earlier this year. I can't remember, but like this is the first I had forgotten completely about it, and then seeing this new trailer was like, oh yeah, this actually looks freaking awesome. So I'm happy to see it here.
Anything to add, Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that kind of jumps out at me is like, this does remind me a lot of like Duke Nukem or Doom or something, just because of that mix between the 3D environments and the sprite-based characters and weapons here. But yeah, I mean, it does look pretty cool here. I'd love to see more of the title, and I think that like a lot of the animation work that they have going into the weapons in particular, like the firing animations, the reloading animations,
right,
all that stuff, it's really, really high quality stuff, and it feels very, very impactful. Like they really nailed that. I think that's so critical here in nailing this aesthetic and really putting it together. So I'm excited to see what they do with it for sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting merging of a relatively low poly 3D environment, and along with those fantastic sprites. I'm not quite sure when it's coming out. It just says coming 2025. But we'll certainly be looking forward to that one. The final game we want to talk about, John, Like a Dragon Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii.
So I kind of want to mention this for a couple of reasons. This game was revealed prior to the Xbox thing, but it's being shown here again, and it just reminded me of just the exceptional work coming out of RGG Studio these days, and how they've seemingly mastered the art of creating very compelling games within a very short time frame, or more like they're able to juggle projects in such a way that they're able to get these out basically at like 1 or even sometimes 2 games a year. And these games are not short, but they've essentially found a formula that works, a framework that works. They've got their technology side down, their art pipelines down, and the proper amount of content reuse for certain types of assets and things. And they've found a way to keep creating new stories. Like, even though these are all individual games that are sold, by themselves, this almost feels like they've somehow stumbled into the old episodic model that was promised to us during the mid 2000s, right? When you hear about Half-Life episode 1 and episode 2 and like the Sin episodes and all that, they've kind of figured that out, but with like full games where they're able to deliver these big projects at like a regular clip. So much so that at the end of the trailer, even, like, it's almost like just showing off at this point. They showed like the date of February 28th, and then they scratched it out and put 21st. It's like, no, we're so good, we're actually bringing the release date forward a week, which is hilarious. And then conceptually speaking, just like the game looks ridiculous. It's another sort of side story thing. They're taking, just they're reveling in this sort of like pirate lunacy. And I'm very curious to see where this actually ends up going and what this becomes, because wow.
Right.
And I wonder if they'll actually be able to squeeze another arcade game in this, because that's been kind of their thing lately, right? Like they did the Sega Racing Classic 2, Daytona USA 2 was in the Man Without a Name release, and then what was in the, I forget which one was in the other. I think VF3 might have been in the other, in the Yakuza 8. I'm blanking on the name, but this one, I'm kind of holding out hope, despite the pirate theme, that we might actually see something like Scud Race in here. I feel like that's the natural point of what would be included next.
Any reactions to this one, Oliver?
No, like John said, I mean, I think it's a real break with the modern games industry, and a real special thing that they managed to pump out these games on such a regular basis. I mean, the last title only came out earlier this year, I believe, back in January or February. So this is a pretty insane pace to have. Yeah.
Just before that, they did the side story. The Man Without a Name was like literally like 2 or 3 months before that.
Yeah, that's pretty nuts, isn't it? That's pretty nuts. But I mean, I think, yeah, there's nothing objectionable with the way this game looks. It looks pretty great, actually, I think. Like the environments look awesome. The ship combat, I mean, it's very reminiscent of a certain Assassin's Creed title, or a certain few Assassin's Creed titles, but I think it looks pretty cool here. And yeah, I mean, I just think it's super impressive that they're able to pump these games out on such a regular basis.
Would you describe the ship combat as quadruple A, Oliver?
Yeah, Skull and Bones. Yeah, I suppose that's the non-Assassin's Creed title with the ship combat there. Well, hopefully this game fares a little bit better commercially than Skull and Bones, but that's my only thought there. Yeah.
I've got to ask, that was the 5 games that we chose, but I've got to ask you about this one, John. Wu Chang Fallen Feathers.
Oh yeah,
it actually looks pretty good, I think.
It does.
The extent to which there's, I mean, obviously, just due to the way it takes games years to develop, it's not any kind of reaction to Wukong, Black Myth Wukong, but
or is it? Because Black Myth Wukong was announced a long time ago, as we know.
But what can I say? That was certainly a bit of a surprise there.
Oh yeah, actually, I mean, it does seem to be another character action game in that style from a Chinese developer. And that's really cool. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious in the last year or so that last few years, I'd say Chinese development is really stepping up. They're producing some big games, some very impressive games, and finding these new markets. So it's pretty cool to see. And visually, this looks great. And I'm always on board for another awesome character action game. And this one seems to have a spear that acts as a chain gun and or flamethrower, which, Wukong did not
historically accurate.
So yeah, this seems to be more like character, like there's I don't know if it's character classes or what's going on here, but the number of moves and types of magic that the player seems to have access to is quite significant. So I'll be curious to see what you can do there as well.
Mm-hmm. It's coming day one rather to Game Pass, and I'm in 2025, and I'm kind of curious if we're going to be looking at a Wukong versus Wu Chang face-off. But only time will tell there.
Two Chinese titans facing off.
Okay, let's move on. Big hardware announcement this week, the Analogue 3D. Analogue are back. They're making a FPGA-based N64 with a range of potentially great features. John, tell me what you know about this one.
Yeah, so this is the next line of console from Analogue, obviously. The last one being the Duo, which is a nice take on the PC Engine. But I feel like this is interesting because this is, first of all, they're using a larger FPGA than they've done in the past, significantly larger than even what's in the Mr. FPGA, which, by the way, the Mr. FPGA does have an excellent N64 core already. And it seems like they've spent a while doing their own unique core that is unrelated to that. And the idea here seems to be to offer an N64 that can match or exceed the sort of capabilities that you get with an HDMI modded N64. Like if you have the Ultra HDMI or the the N64 digital from Black Dog, where it's essentially adding HDMI digital output capabilities to these systems. This one is fully 4K output. They talk about the CRT filters in there. They boast 100% compatibility, which I will certainly put to the test, because there are a few games with some rather that aren't well emulated or emulated properly, and even require hacks to work properly, even on the Mr. Core. So we'll see what happens there. There's also the new 8BitDo controller to go along with it, which is wireless, and it reminds me of the modern Wii Pro controller, but with more of an N64 layout, which could be really nice. I guess one of the things that stood out to me, though, is in an interview that they did over on Engadget, they actually specifically called out the fact that there will be an optional mode that's like something basically modifying the way the RAM speeds work, and some other things that bottleneck the real N64 that can allow for higher frame rates optionally.
Okay.
And this is something I'm very curious to see, because a lot of these games have target frame rates that are much higher than what they actually deliver, right? And I'll be curious to see how far they can actually push this, because it's not a real N64. It is obviously an FPGA, so there's more room to play around with things like that. And if that is indeed something that works as it sounds, we could be looking at a case where you get very nice video, accurate output, but smoother performance. They also weirdly mention VRR is supported, which I don't know. We'll see what that actually.
It's going to be great for all those 20 FPS N64 games.
That's what I was thinking. I was like, they're going to need ultra low frame rate compensation here, depending on how that goes. But thinking about it, I think this is actually the first analog system that supports 4K output.
Right.
I think everything up to this point has been 1080p max. So this one is full 4K. So, and it has an updated OS as well. Like, there's a lot going on here that it's all just a feature list for now, but it seems extremely promising and very interesting. And plus I like the actual physical design is top tier. You guys have seen it, right? It's a really beautiful looking machine. It's sort of like, it has elements of the design language of the original N64, but sort of a modern take on it, and shrunken down significantly. And they do retain original controller ports as well on the front. So even though there are wireless controllers you can use, and it seems like they denote that there's a little LED. So basically on the N64 style controller ports, there's little LEDs within each controller port. So if you're connected to player one wirelessly, that LED lights up. So you know that controller port's filled with a wireless controller, or you could plug in an actual wired one instead. I think that's super cool. So I don't know. Well, plus the price, it's $250. And yeah, their shipping cost stuff is always not great, but for HDMI output N64s, if you get into the real hardware and you get one modded, those tend to sell for quite a bit more than this. You can't get an Ultra HDMI N64 for like under $250. That's for sure. Wow. So this ends up being a pretty darn good deal, I would say, if it lives up to promises. So that's kind of where I'm at. That's why I'm very interested to see how it actually plays out.
Oliver, do you have much history with the N64? Do you have much interest in this product?
Oh, I mean, the N64 was my very first console.
No way, really?
Yeah, for sure. Mario 64 and the N64 and Star Fox and all that good stuff. So I'd be very interested in playing N64 again, and I think this is possibly a great piece of kit for making me interested in actually enjoying some of those older N64 carts again, because I don't really have room in my apartment for something that can take composite input. I don't really want to fiddle with scalars. I don't want to have to sort out that controller situation. The idea of an all-in-one box that does all that, outputs to a modern screen, and has high-quality CRT emulation, especially now that I have a screen that can do like ridiculous brightness levels. So the brightness level of that CRT emulation is not going to be annoying to me. That does make me genuinely interested in playing N64 titles again. And I mean, the N64 was a pretty pivotal console for me, and I still have a lot of N64 carts, so for sure I'd be interested in going over to this and checking it out. The one thing that did seem a little bit curious to me here, and I don't know if you have any insight into this, John, is the pre-order date. They said, I believe it's October 21st, but they have not announced any kind of ship date. And I think in the past they might have said that this was scheduled for 2024, but it seems weird to me to say, oh, pre-orders start on the 21st, but we don't know when we'll ship it to you. If that'll be, next year, when that will be exactly. That's the one bit of weirdness to me.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I would hope that they actually reveal that soon. The ordering of products from them is always a little bit iffy in terms of the allotments of units and timing and all that. There's always a little bit of mystery around that for sure. That can be frustrating. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But yes, it looks like pre-order date is October 21st, but no actual release date is announced.
Okie doke. Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about this one for one reason. It's all about that overclocking, because we've kind of discussed this in the past, John, where the kind of games that hold up over time are those that actually run well, as opposed to, having the most fantastic looking graphics. And the N64, most of the games, or many of the games rather, just didn't really run particularly well. So, we can look back with fondness to, GoldenEye, but, those split screens sessions were running at 8 to 10 FPS in parts. I'm really looking forward to seeing what this thing can actually do in terms of making these games run as we kind of imagine that they used to, but didn't. So that's a major sort of factor for me about this one. We got this interesting question from Dudley the Gentleman.
Nice.
Hi DF crew, what is the likelihood of Analogue creating a Dreamcast? What are the potential roadblocks to such a device being developed? The reason I included this question is that the Dreamcast is, what can I say? It was Sega's last console, effectively.
Yeah.
And it holds a level of affection within the gaming audience that is kind of stands apart, stands alone. I think we'd love to see an Analogue Dreamcast. What is the likelihood, John?
I mean, seeing what they've done here with N64, using the larger Cyclone 10GX FPGA, I'm starting to think that the fact that smaller FPGA chips have been able to handle N64, Saturn, and the like already, I'm wondering if we're reaching the point where Dreamcast is feasible. The problem is, though, I feel like the clock speeds and just the complexity of what's happening on the chip increases dramatically when you get to Dreamcast era, to the point where I don't know enough about FPGA programming, reverse engineering this stuff to say for sure, but that seems like a pretty tall order, right? And it's not a nut that has been cracked yet, as far as I can tell. Nobody's really gone down this road before, and that seems like a pretty challenging one, just in terms of getting it right. But still, the Dreamcast itself is fundamentally fairly simple in terms of what chips it uses. It's straightforward enough that maybe it's possible. I feel like if you get to PlayStation 2 and beyond, that's getting into territory where I have a hard time believing that there's an FPGA chip that you could realistically put in a unit at a reasonable price, let alone engineer a core for it. That starts to seem impossible. But Dreamcast is borderline, and I'm very curious to see if that can be done. But the other side of Dreamcast, though, it uses the GD-ROM format, and I don't remember the specifics as to what it takes to read those discs, and if it's just a software thing, what does combination with the laser software or whatever, what does it actually take to physically read those discs? Can they actually overcome the copyright stuff? That's what's not clear to me right now. And we've not seen, so something like the Polymega has support for game consoles that had sort of copy protected discs, right? Like PlayStation and Saturn, but that just rips the image to the machine and then it plays it that way, I believe. Or at least it's not something where you're reading it the way original hardware did. So I'm really curious to see what can be done there. I don't know. It seems like a huge challenge is what I'm saying. I'm just thinking out loud about all the potential roadblocks here.
Fair enough. Let's move on. Okay, next news story. Obviously, recently we had the reveal of, what was it called? Project Foundry, running on Unreal Engine 5, which is a brand new direction for Halo. And now in the wake of that, we're starting to see some aspects of perhaps what could have been projects that were never announced, but are now coming to light and were rumoured at the time. One of which was it's now cancelled, a Halo Infinite Battle Royale that was being developed by certain Affinity, so not 343 directly as such. And yes, we now have confirmation that it actually existed, according to certain Affinity's former design director, Mike Klopper. And he described it as, well, he said, I led a large team of designers working on a cancelled Battle Royale mode for Halo, so a mode, so not a game. I believe this product could have been a game changer for the franchise. We loved playing it and working on it. It was a fantastic experience in spite of its cancellation. Now, here's the thing, John. Me Too products, Battle Royales, that kind of thing. We're not hugely enthusiastic generally about them, but I've got to say, just the concept, if somebody said to me there's going to be a Battle Royale mode for Halo, I think I'd be all over it.
Gosh darn it, Rich. This is the third multiplayer game this episode that has me interested. What's going on here? I don't understand.
Well, it's kind of interested to a point, because you're never going to play it.
We're never going to play it. I agree. I feel like certain Affinity actually would have been a good partner for this, as they say. But, man, Halo as a Battle Royale, to me, makes a ton of sense and seems like a really interesting, good concept for it. I mean, just imagine, you go back to the Silent Cartographer map, the famous map from Halo 1. You have a map like that, and the whole map is wide open for Battle Royale action with all that Halo gear, maybe bringing in some of those drop ships. I don't know, like the whole thing just feels like it's the combination of Halo style physics where things can just go crazy and you never know what's going to happen, combined with just the aesthetic and the core gameplay mechanics, all of that coming together. That feels like something that would be a lot of fun to play. Mm-hmm. And Halo mechanically is still extremely different than the typical first-person shooter. It's extremely different than Fortnite, Call of Duty, and all that. And so the thing with like Call of Duty, you play it right, you go down fast. They kind of simulate that pretty realistically. Well, maybe still not actually realistically, but when you take down an enemy, there's like, you get the drop on them, they're down fast. Halo has the shield mechanic on top of the health mechanic, and that layered mechanic and the way it ties in with the different weapons creates a really interesting balance to things that I think would lend itself well to Battle Royale, because it means you can get into potentially a pinch like this where, oh shoot, you almost go down. But depending on the weapon that the enemy chose and the shield and everything like that, you have a chance to sort of survive that battle, then continue on and your shield goes back up. I feel like there's a lot of potential there for just something that feels mechanically different and still very engaging and suitably Halo. Plus just exploiting those types of maps. It would have been a great way to revisit ideas in addition to bringing new ones in. Like I said, I'm a Silent Cartographer as a Battle Royale map. I mean, you guys, that sounds incredible, right? Like, come on. Mm-hmm. Am I the only one excited by that idea? Like it's an iconic design.
No, I mean, I think the Silent Cartographer map is a Battle Royale. That's very interesting because it is like an island and you have all those little installations on it. And I mean, exactly. Now that you mention it,
I know.
That sounds very interesting.
What if it's Battle Royale, you can actually get up on top of the structures that previously required the Warthog jump, made famous by early videos.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that would be quite tremendous. Yeah, the grenade Warthog jumps. How could I forget? Of course. I'm in complete agreement with John here. I think this could have been really interesting. I think because Halo among modern shooters is really, really well suited to large scale multiplayer, I think, because like John said, the time to kill is fairly generous. Like you need to empty 2/3 of an assault rifle clip onto someone before they expire there. And the weapons aren't laser accurate. So unlike in a game like Call of Duty, where you're just able to kind of pinpoint someone from 200 meters and take them out, here that wouldn't necessarily be the case. By default, the weapons in Halo tend to be much more close range in terms of their application there. In games like Call of Duty, I feel like you have to adapt them a little bit to make them work for Battle Royale. Like you need to increase the time to kill. You need to start throwing in vehicles in there. Of course, in Halo, you have a really wide range of vehicles and they're all very player friendly and they have very responsive physics and they feel very good to control here. In Call of Duty, they have to add those in. They have to adapt the game here for like, especially for just a multiplayer mode, they already have all of that material to work with here. And when you look at how Halo functions, especially on big team battle maps where you have larger encounters with many players, I think this could have been very compelling as a mode. And I think that they have all the ingredients to kind of make it work by default. But on the other hand, I guess it depends on the level of development effort that would have gone into this. Because I do feel that for something more discreet than just a mode for Halo Infinite, Fortnite is such a juggernaut at this point, along with Warzone and, of course, PUBG. It's hard to compete with that. And, of course, Halo's multiplayer numbers are not, like, enormous, from what I can tell at this point either. So it is a franchise that's perhaps not conducive to launching this kind of effort. And then also other big battle royales are not that successful or have not been that successful. Like I played a lot of Battlefield 5's Firestorm mode. Thought that was quite good. But that was not a huge success, and they didn't follow it up in 2042. Although I think they are following it up in the next big Battlefield title, apparently according to some leaks. But it just seems like a difficult space to enter into. But if you're bolting on a big Warzone type map, a big Battle Royale type map onto an existing game with existing mechanics, existing vehicles, existing guns, all that stuff already, I feel like that might be a bit of an easier thing to do here, and it might have been a very worthwhile mode because, you know, it does seem like a franchise that's really ripe for a Battle Royale entry for sure.
And there's one of the things that defines Battle Royale games are the quote unquote moments, you know, where crazy things happen and everybody's laughing about the results. And Halo has always had that built in. And a lot of it come down to some of the strategy. Like I remember in Hang 'em High, I always loved this. There was this in the original game, you could jump off a high ledge and there was an overshield down below. The height of that fall would normally kill you, right? But if you jumped off and landed on the overshield, you got that moment of invincibility that would save you. And so you would often result in a situation where people would be jumping off, surviving with the overshield, and either somebody would follow you down there and die, or, you know, you just create sort of these moments where you land, take dudes out, and you continue. Or the way weapons balance, like when you have a tank, for instance, the tank is extremely deadly in Halo, but if you have like a plasma-based weapon, for instance, you just unload on the turret of the tank driver, the rotation speed is decreased by the plasma weapon, meaning that they can't even aim at you anymore, right? So everything has this like rock, paper, scissors sort of mechanic going on. It was kind of part of the Halo mechanics that allows for this really fun interplay between things, which means even if you have a basic little plasma pistol, it doesn't mean you're out. Right? You can still use that to your advantage, and there are strategies there. And I think this sort of interplay between these crazy weapons is what would have made for a really cool Battle Royale experience that's more varied and interesting than perhaps what we already have.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, the lore is there. The weapons are there. The vehicles are there, you know, from everything from, you know, the Warthog right down to those gigantic starships. Everything is there that could have made this a really interesting game. But I can imagine that actually, you know, similar, well, I guess there's parallels of a kind to The Last of Us with its cancelled multiplayer where, you know, it could have been a project that was so big, it could have just overwhelmed the entire development. But yeah, we can only think about what might have been. But, you know, you just think about everything that Halo has to offer, the world building that they've managed to develop over the last couple of decades. And maybe it would have been just wish fulfillment to actually have a battle royale built around those elements. But those elements are there and it would have been fantastic. So I don't know, maybe at some point there'll be some leaks from these major cancelled projects that would have given us more indication of what might have been. But in the meantime, you know, I guess, yeah, this is an interesting one. And I can only assume that it was cancelled for good reason. That's the only thing I can really think of at that point. Interesting story, though, nonetheless. Let's move on. Okay, so we've had the Tomb Raider 1 to 3 remasters, and it looks as though 4 to 6 is incoming. And, well, John, you're a big Tomb Raider fan. You must be really excited about this.
So I was happy with what they did with Tomb Raider 1 to 3. I made a nice video on it earlier this year. They essentially employed community members that had a long history with working on sort of refreshing the Tomb Raider games to bring these back. And you got both classic graphics mode as well as the sort of enhanced remastered, which was, higher quality textures and updated models and such. So it did have a slightly strange look to it because it was extremely faithful to the original core mechanics, animations, and all that, but they just updated certain assets. But I thought it felt good overall, and it looked really nice. 4 through 6, though, is an interesting one. First of all, I think 4 and 5 kind of got a bad reputation back in the day because this was during the time when Tomb Raider was an annual series. And by the time you get to Tomb Raider 4, everything's like, oh, another one of these? It was the exact same engine technology, nothing new. But I think in actuality, I would say Tomb Raider 4 is pretty good. I think it's a lot better than 3 was. And I think it's kind of it tried to go back to some of the more Tomb Raiding roots as opposed to like going heavy on the human-based combat and all these weird sort of like around the world kind of locations that were more man-made structures. Well, modern man-made structures, if you will. And there's some cool stuff there. And I think maybe with that distance, people might be able to appreciate it more. So I'm eager to see that. But 6, they call it 6. And that's the first time I think I've actually heard it officially referred to as 6. They're talking about Angel of Darkness for PlayStation 2 and eventually PC, which is a controversial game to say the least. This is the game that basically put Core Design out of business. They struggled to create this new engine, this new technology. They had some very ambitious ideas as to what Tomb Raider could be. And I admit back in the day, I finished this game the summer it came out, and I liked it somewhat. I liked it conceptually, and I thought it was interesting as a game. It just felt very unfinished, right? Like it's like, oh, I'm playing a beta version of something that's pretty cool. And even though it was kind of broken in many ways, I was still able to appreciate and enjoy what they tried to do, because there is some good stuff in here. And that's why I'm very curious to see what they do with this game in this remaster. There have been attempts to sort of improve it after the fact in the community side, but I really wonder what this is going to look like and like how much better they can actually polish it up. Part of the problem I always had with it was that the first half of the game, not first half, it's like the first chunk takes place in Paris, and you're just running around the Paris streets kind of solving mysteries and talking to people, which is conceptually okay, but it was all divided up into these tiny little areas with like long loading screens between them, which to me reeked of like, we couldn't figure out how to do proper data streaming yet on the PlayStation 2, even though plenty of other games had at that point. Clearly Core Design, they couldn't quite get that going, and they had to divide it up into multiple chunks. And later in the game, it's less of a problem, but early on, it really kills the pacing. And I'll see if they can handle that. There's also the stuff with, what's his name, like Trevor? I don't even, there's that male character, remember? Where late in the game, you take control of him, and I think you're like in an asylum, and it starts to play more like a survival horror game, which is super weird. And I don't know. So, but I have not revisited Angel of Darkness since that initial playthrough. I have dabbled in it on PC, but my main focal point is on the PS2 version, which I loaded up recently, actually. And I actually think it looks quite visually good for the PS2 era. Like there's some really nice lighting and effects going on. It does run at 60 frames per second, though it gets... It because it's field rendered, it has that problem where when it does slow down, the frame rate cuts in half and it just runs in slow motion, which was a not unusual problem on some PS2 games. So it literally had slowdown, if you will, because it ran slow. But we'll see. The PC version, though, back in the day, I don't know if you guys remember, it was one of the first PC games to support programmable pixel shading. It was very well known for that because it actually had like pixel shader water and other effects, where they did certain effects on PS2 that were probably leveraging the weird hardware of the PS2, and to simulate that on PC, they kind of took it a different way and they implemented shaders into it. So it ended up looking kind of different in the PS2 game, but it had its own cool look with like reflective puddles and water that were all done using pixel shading instead. And it was one of the earlier examples of this, of a game shipping with those features, which again, pretty cool. I assume that's what this new version will be based on, that PC version sort of pulled up with improvements, I hope. So either way, I will be covering that for sure.
Okay. Do you have any affinity with these Tomb Raider games, Oliver?
No, I do not have a certain affinity with these titles very much. I've not played them myself. I think this is very much a John joint here. The last round of Tomb Raider, yeah, I think just in terms of the interest. The last Tomb Raider remasters seemed quite successful, so I'd expect pretty good results here as well. Like that upgraded visual cauldron, that upgraded visual mixture with the revised textures, the models, the baked lighting, the shadow maps, seemed like a solid combination, seemed to produce pretty good results in those titles. But I do think their approach also does have certain limitations that we're seeing here. Like when you're keeping the same environmental geometry, you're not doing like big new complex model rigs, you're not redoing the animation work. I think there's a limit realistically to what can probably be achieved with like, especially these, PS1 era titles, 4 and 5 there.
Yeah.
And I do think like as you start to push rendering technology further, almost weirdly, the expectation for some elements of that technology increase, and you can end up in an awkward space. But I think they've counterbalanced it such that the lighting looks significantly better, but they're not kind of pushing too far in the realm of model detail to the point where the animation work looks totally discordant with what is already in those titles. So yeah, I think this is pretty cool. I think the quality of some of those later Tomb Raider titles is a bit more questionable, like John said. But it seems like a worthwhile project, and I hope to see a good, nice lengthy John video at some point close to release.
So John, we got to go back to Trevor.
I
sent
was
you
wrong.
a link with the Angel of Darkness characters. I'm not
Yes.
seeing a Trevor. Which one are you referring to?
I'm referring to Curtis Trent.
Curtis Trent.
Curtis, essentially he finished his tenure with Korn, and decided to become an action hero in Tomb Raider.
Okay, I'm just loving some of these character names in the.
He's
in
very
Tomb
much
Raider.
of that era. Yeah, there's Werner von Croy, of course, Joachim Carroll, Peter von Eckhart, Christina Boas, Margot Cartier. There's so much here. The one last thing though that kind of occurred to me though about these Tomb Raider games is that because they're still they're of an era where the geometry is relatively boxy and environments are fairly sparse and clear, right? Yet they're still challenging to navigate and figure out your way through. And I kind of realized that this sort of game kind of couldn't exist with modern graphics because
Too hard.
right, because you walk into a room in Tomb Raider and your eyes you're able to easily scan the room and kind of understand where the different entrances and exits are, where the interaction points might be. And then it's a sort of figuring out how the heck do you get there. But modern graphics are so complex and detailed that I don't think you could rely on that. Like, I think you walk into a room this complex, but with modern graphics, nobody'd be able to parse it. You just look at it and be like, I don't know what I can do here. I have no idea what I can interact with. And this is where stuff like the yellow paint comes from. The graphics are too good now. Like, they're too detailed. Right. And some developers have managed to work around this and guide the player, but I still think largely we don't see level design as intricate as this sort of era of game, just because of the way that the complexity of these things. And it's a really curious sort of phenomenon, but detailed graphics kind of made this stuff harder to make in terms of like spelling out to the player what you can and cannot do.
Just to round off, John, we got this supporter question from Stuart Hart. Hello, double exclamation point. So Tomb Raider 4, 5 and 6 are getting the remaster treatment. While I feel it was admirable to bring the first 3 games to modern platforms, warts and all, I felt porting the games over as a near one-to-one replica was a missed opportunity. Considering Angel of Darkness is considered an, in brackets, very low point for the series, would you feel it acceptable if the game was remastered without fixing any of its glaring gameplay bugs? if they even fix all the bugs, is it a worthy endeavor at all, considering it's, quite frankly, a poor game?
Oh, I disagree with him.
Okay.
I think it's an interesting enough game that's worthy of this regardless, but I would at least hope that they fix the bugs. Because
I think that's fair
the
enough.
bugs need to be fixed, because those were problematic for sure. But I think there's still an interesting game here, and it's not as bad as people have suggested. Although my tolerance for this is probably higher than most. This was also the game they introduced full analog control, by the way. It was no longer tank controls on PS2 at least. So I'll be curious to see how that plays out. And lastly, I mean, it's got Curtis Trent in it. Come on.
AKA Trevor.
AKA Trevor. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how he didn't become a mainstay in the series. Curtis Trent.
Well, yeah,
Crystal really missed out when they took over the Tomb Raider franchise. You know,
exactly. Yeah, there could have been some Curtis Trent spin-offs.
Instead of Lara Croft Tomb Raider, it'd be Lara Croft plus Curtis Trent Tomb Raider. And
Tomb Raiders.
Tomb Raiders. That's the Japanese name of Tomb Raider 1, by the way. Tomb Raiders.
Okay.
Okay, I'll stop now. I'm sorry for being pedantic and weird during this, but I have a passion for this era of these games, so please forgive me.
Fair enough. Okay, let's move on. Okay, next news story, an interesting topic that came up on video cards, actually, which is, Samsung has announced that it's developed the first GDDR7 memory featuring 24 gigabits capacity. So that's essentially 3 gigabytes of memory per module. Now, this is quite interesting because what it means is that, well, typically, the way things are right now, if you have a 128-bit or 256-bit memory interface on a graphics card, you're pretty much limited to just 8 or 16 gigabytes of memory. And that's a bit of a problem, bearing in mind lower-end graphics cards typically have only 8 gigs of memory, the exception being the 3060, of course. Now, this is interesting because now it looks as though going forward, graphics card manufacturers will have more options. You know, a 128-bit interface or 256 can, ship with 12 gigs of memory or even 24 gigs of memory. This has been a hugely contentious topic because, typically I would expect a 30 series class product from Nvidia to match the current generation of consoles, basically. That's what I think that class of product should be doing. Compute-wise, it pretty much gets there, and you have extra features like DLSS and frame generation, etc. All good. But you're sort of lumbered with 8 gigs of memory. That's not good. So potentially moving forward, there's the opportunity that we can have lower-end graphics cards that will ship with 12 gigs of memory. The thing that I've sort of seen so far is that there's been talk of the next generation 5080, which is going to have a 256-bit interface, shipping as standard with 16 gigs of memory, but there will be like a 24 gigabyte variant, presumably using these Samsung modules. So I guess, first of all, the question is whether lower-end GPUs are actually going to use GDDR7 at all, or whether they'll stick with the existing GDDR6. And the extent to which we will actually see these 3 gigabyte modules permeate down into the lower end of the stack, where I think they're kind of most needed, to be honest. Oliver, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, I think the development of non-binary GDDR7 memory configurations is a pretty nice development, like Rich said, because it does open up the possibility for various configurations that are potentially tantalizing to us, including with 4 modules, doing 12 gigs, with 8 modules doing 24 gigs. Obviously, that's something that does open up a lot of possibilities on low end, and then also towards the mid-range and higher end for something like a potential 5080 card. I think here it's the motivation behind producing these modules is probably not necessarily as much to open up certain headroom in the low end of the market. I think from what I can see here, the motivation is just producing a 4 gigabyte module with today's memory technology is just challenging based off of the way that nanolithography is scaling with some of these parts. So getting a 3 gigabyte module is a good middle step there. The only thing I would note here is that based off of what they're talking about here in terms of the production timeline, stretching to 2025 here, it probably suggests maybe that those 3 GB cards, the cards with the 3 GB modules, would be coming out towards the end of that year or towards the middle of that year potentially, and not at the very beginning of that year. So it might be, around the summertime or something, maybe by the time an RTX 5060 is rolling around, that we might see these cards, and not necessarily at the beginning of that year. But again, that kind of does line up. I mean, hopefully it does line up in the end with the release of some of those cards that use a 128-bit memory interface, where I think this issue is most pressing, because there right now with the 2 GB modules, you're only getting an 8 GB card or a 16 GB card, depending on if you use 4 or 8, whereas here you could probably get a pretty easy 12 there, and actually have parity finally with the RTX 3060 Ti way back when, at least in terms of that memory capacity for something like a 4060.
It was the base 3060 that actually shipped with
the 3060. Right, yeah.
Yeah, bizarrely, the 3060 Ti had 8 gigs of memory. It's just...
Oh, right, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, you could finally have parity with that 2-generation-old card for your 5060 at least.
Yes, that's what vintage 2020. Number one in the Steam hardware survey as of today, however. John, do you have any particular thoughts on this?
Not really. I mean, I feel like you guys kind of covered this off pretty well, and I've been talking a lot already, so...
Yeah, you've got more talking to do.
Exactly.
The next topic. But yeah, I mean, what can I say? I mean, I'm just hoping that we do actually start to see more memory move into the lower end of the market. And for various reasons, it just hasn't happened. The kind of exception to the rule has been the 3060. And I'm still not quite sure why that happened. I think because Nvidia realized that the only alternative for the 3060 would have been to put out a 6 GB version of that card, which in 2020, up against, consoles shipping with, 16 gigs of memory, would have been a really bad idea. I think they made the right call there. But that sort of exception to the rule has led to things like, The Last of Us Part 1 running on PC with, high-end textures runs a lot faster on the 3060 than it does on the 4060, even though notionally the 4060 is a considerably faster product. It's just using so much memory that, only the 3060 can cope there. I really do want to see lower end cards move up to 12 gigs minimum. I don't know whether that's going to happen in the short term, but at least now it seems that the technology is emerging to actually be able to make this happen, theoretically even. But, just have to wait and see. Let's move on. Okay, John, it's time to do some talking again.
Oh boy.
Killing Time Resurrected. Nightdive Studios are back. You've played this. You're quite excited about it.
Yes, I wanted to do a full video on it actually, but other things came up instead, so we're talking about it here. Killing Time is an extremely interesting game, and I'm very happy to see Nightdive tackle this. Like, between this and stuff like PO'd, it's neat to see them digging into the lesser known stuff in the history of first person shooters. Killing Time actually started life on the 3DO the idea is that it's sort of it's a more open-ended shooter, and it tells the story using sort of these like in-world FMV sequences, almost like Ghosts, similar to The Seventh Guest actually. But you're going through shooting enemies and getting through these mazes. But in 1995, it was also released on the PC, but the PC version was completely different. It was actually a better game, I would say. The level design was much more complex, and the engine seemed a lot more capable. Plus, it ran better. It ran very slowly on 3DO. I would say the difference between them is that the 3DO game feels like an extension of Wolfenstein 3D. It's a lot of very boxy, simple environments. It can do angled walls and it can do stairs, but it's overall very, very simple in terms of layout, whereas the PC game is more in line with something like the Doom engine, but I would say even beyond that, it can do like proper rooms above rooms, and it's inching towards like what the build engine could do. What Nightdive's done is they've essentially created a fusion of the two, because the complaint with the PC game was always that they replaced all the cool FMV based sprites and realistic stuff and the weapons and everything with these like new, more cartoony looking assets that were also very, very low res, like way lower res than the 3DO version. So they've essentially transplanted 3DO assets into this this PC version of the game that has been reworked for the consoles. But although in Nightdive fashion, they also allow you to toggle on the old PC sprites if you prefer, which is cool. But the idea here is that you're essentially exploring almost like a giant open island that's somewhat non-linear in design. Like you start on this boat, you're walking around the docks, but you eventually make your way up into like this giant mansion, like garden area. You can go all out in the back in the forest, and there's like the hunter shacks out there, and it's all like huge, spread out and seamless. So you're exploring this gigantic island, piecing together story through these FMV bits that occur along the way, dealing with enemies. And it's Doom-like at its core in terms of how it plays, but there's more story there. Like, for instance, to get into the mansion at the beginning, you actually have to find like a guest pass, like to get into this supposedly exclusive party, even though it's all run by ghosts now, but there's like a force that keeps you out otherwise. So instead of just getting like generic key, you are getting objects that then further the story, and you start to see more like sort of these like weird flashbacks, ghost like sequences of what happened there. So it's an attempt at storytelling within a large open environment that that was really pretty still fresh in 1995. It was a very unique game for the time. I'm a little disappointed that they didn't include the 3DO game as well as sort of an optional bonus thing, but I'm still happy that they kind of combined the two. And of course, being Nightdive, it runs like a dream on every platform. If you're on either Xbox Series consoles or PlayStation 5, you get 120 frames per second gameplay, fully adjustable FOV, various other graphical options, texture filtering on and off, that you can pop in the old style sprites. You can tweak the gameplay to be more like the originals. There's various other enhancements and quality of life things that you can play with. They redid so many of the assets at a much higher resolution, including like world textures and stuff. So it's very, very sharp and clean looking now. So it really feels like this like ultimate take on what Killing Time was trying to be, but done through this like modern lens, with all the expected improvements. And it's another example of Nightdive just doing what they do better than basically anyone. They're able to remaster these games, bring them back, fuse the best parts of them together into a cohesive whole, and do so without anything feeling out of place. Like it still feels like a proper 1995 game, just enhanced. And it's awesome. So I really cannot recommend this high enough if you're looking for sort of a unique shooter from that period that's kind of unlike other things at the time, especially atmosphere wise. It really leverages the digital audio capabilities of what the 3DO and then the PC could do, like the music and sound effects, for instance. So it's all much more like CD audio, but very creepy, dark, ambient stuff. Although the game does get a little bit goofy with like killer chefs and like weird clowns that try to strangle you, and it definitely goes places, but I do think it is absolutely worth checking out.
I just don't quite understand, but I do love it, the fact that Nightdive are able to make a viable business model from resurrecting, as it were, these really old and somewhat obscure games.
I agree. And I don't know how they make it work. I assume that they've got a team that they know the budgets that it takes to make this stuff happen. And these guys are really into this stuff, and they're able to just somehow get it done. And
the other thing, of course, is the Kex engine. They seem to be able to take pretty much any older game, preserve the gameplay mechanics within their new engine. The logistics of that completely, I've just got no idea how they do it.
I agree. It's an amazing asset for them. And, Sam and all of those guys over there, they're top talent, super smart programmers that really get these games, right? And they understand what makes these games special and what makes them feel a certain way. So it really feels like it comes from a place of like genuine care, as opposed to just like, we're just making this product to make money. And I'm all over that. So again, this is awesome. And now that they're delving into weird stuff like this, I wouldn't be surprised to see stuff like freaking ZPC, zero population count, Come on, guys, make it happen. We need some ZPC action here brought back. I assume you guys have no idea what that is.
No.
It's okay. It was a game that ran on Bungie's Marathon 2 engine, and it used, I want to say, like very cartoon style graphics, but it was like kind of this weird edgy thing that was for Mac and PC, released in late '96. And I remember playing it and thinking there was nothing else that looked like this game, but it's so weird and such a deep cut that it feels almost natural at this point that Nightdive's going to tackle it.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see.
Any thoughts, Oliver?
Wow. I mean, the one thing that's really weird is like that integration of FMV into the world.
Right.
Like that's kind of intense. That's something I admit I've not seen before in a game. It's very of the era, I would say, but certainly interesting relative to other titles that I think were using FMV in more conservative circumstances. But yeah, I mean, this looks very compelling. Like PO'd, it's a game that I would have never had any reason to look at outside of these remasters. But it is, it's a title that I'm glad they're taking a look at. And like you said, John, I don't know, the commercial interest in titles like these, I would be interested to see how much interest there is, because these Nightdive remasters seem to be targeting titles that are extremely obscure.
Niche. But they're doing it, man. They're doing it.
They're doing it, yeah. There's no doubt about that.
Nightdive has essentially built the reputation now where if they make this thing, they've got an audience of committed gamers that want to play it simply because it's a Nightdive joint. I think that's pretty fantastic. I was just looking at the Destructoid review here, John, and they're talking about how the sprites were enhanced because they were able to get access to the original photographs of the actors.
Right, exactly. So not only did they bring over the FMV style sprites of the 3DO game, but they had the original stuff to work with. So they're able, like when you actually see them in the game, the resolution of these sprites is way, 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 way higher than it originally was back in the day. So like this kind of ties in with what I was talking about earlier with that mouse PI game, where they're essentially leveraging very high resolution sprites to great effect. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. It's super, super cool. Yeah, the remastering work that went into this is significant. They did not just, it's not just a case of upscaling things. Like there was clearly a lot of work put into preserving the way this game looks, but doing it all at a much higher fidelity. And it's just awesome.
Let's move on. Now it's time for a supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show where every week I post on Patreon asking our supporters to comment on the topics that we're going to be covering and to suggest topics and indeed to pose questions for this part of the show. We've got the usual gamut of PS5 Pro stuff to get through. I'm actually going to combine the first three questions into one because I think they're going to be fairly short answers. Let's kick off with this one from Soundwave GI. Greetings, gents! Exclamation point. I've searched high and low to find concrete evidence of the VRR range situation for the PS5 Pro. Will it be capable of 40 to 120 Hz range on unsupported titles like Xbox Series X? I mainly play games on Xbox when they fall into that situation, with Elden Ring being a great example. I always get both consoles, so now that my preferred will be the PS5 Pro, I'm hoping it can compete in this area. I fear that we'll still deal with plenty of games that would drop under the inadequate 48 range and be left with a less than stellar experience. Thanks and keep up the great work! Exclamation point. Well, we don't have any official word on this, right, John? But, we do know kind of how the Sony teams operate historically. Maybe they'll surprise us, but I'm not expecting any changes on the Pro.
No, not at all. I think it's fundamentally there's just a difference in the way that the systems are designed to work, and Sony relies on the games themselves to trigger these 120 hertz modes, which then opens up the VRR range, where Microsoft allows you to force it across the system, and the software just plugs into that, which is how they're able to get these like super wide VRR window range. Because on Xbox, if you only output 60 hertz, you're also much more limited in terms of what VRR can do. It's just because you're able to force 120 across the board that it's able to do this properly. And PS5 games that do support 120 and VRR like that, it works great as well. It's just that it's up to the developer to implement it. So I don't think it's going to change in the Pro.
I mean, it's a bit of a shame, isn't it, Oliver? But that is generally the way that Sony tend to operate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be the same. Every indication probably is that it's going to be the same. And I would expect if there are improvements to the system, that those would carry over to regular PS5 models as well. I would not expect it to be a Pro exclusive. That would be a little bit bizarre.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move on to this question from Nice Marmot. It's a big Lebowski reference, I believe. Maybe I got the pronunciation wrong. Who knows? Anyway, the question is fairly straightforward. Will we see boost mode before PS5 Pro's general release? The total silence around Elden Ring in particular and From Software in general is deafening. It's deafening. Peter asks, IDF Crew exclamation point. As far as you are aware, does the PS5 Pro offer anything akin to FPS boost where a frame rate cap can be overcome without developer intervention? My assumption is no, and that any frame rate boosts mentioned are related to those games that could not previously hold a lock on FPS target, or of course where devs do indeed unlock FPS, thus allowing the extra GPU grunt room to improve frame times. Thanks and have a great week. Okay, cheers for that. Well, I think ultimately there has been a total silence around boost mode. We still don't really know how it works. The only sort of thing that we could apply to it is that the leaked teraflop number for the GPU suggests clock speeds that are broadly equivalent to the standard PlayStation 5. So to get any kind of boost on the GPU side, it follows that it must be using all of the compute units or more of them. The extent to which boost mode improves PlayStation performance, we just don't know. Yeah, that's the bottom line. It's down to Sony to make a statement if they want to make a statement, or for us to test it when it comes in. That's pretty much it. In terms of the FPS boost thing, well, we've seen an example of that because you'll recall that I did a video back in the day with mods from Illusion, where all he was essentially doing was removing the frame rate cap. There were some exceptions, like Bloodborne, for example, where they had to mod in code for Dark Souls 3 to support arbitrary frame rates. But most of Illusion's mods for PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 games, latterly he did move on to PlayStation 5, they were just modding the game to remove the frame rate lock. So in theory it is possible, but in practice it's probably not going to happen. I don't think there's anything more to add to that, Oliver.
I would say that's 3 big no's in all likelihood.
Yes.
For well, at least, yeah. I don't know. The weird thing about the PS5 Pro's boost mode is that if it is good and if it does offer a big enhancement, surely Sony must want to talk about that at some point prior to release, I would think, because that would be a pretty big deal.
I mean, I've pitched it, but I haven't had any response. I mean, I guess the other thing, of course, is always the lingering issue that they don't want the standard PlayStation 5 to look deficient. But at the same time, you do need to show that the Pro is better to justify its very existence. So I guess that's probably maybe down to launch coverage. What do you think, John?
I mean, fundamentally, I just expect this stuff to work pretty much as it did on PS5 and PS4 Pro before it, right? We just don't know the extent of how much it'll actually boost anything. As far as the actual frame rate boosted titles, I think it's just going to come down to whether I kind of feel like that's unlikely at this point, that there's going to be any more titles that are going to be plumbed for this sort of performance boost, right? Because there's nothing really on the PS5 side where you would expect to see this from Sony. And this is where their first party stuff was updated. Like when they went to PS5, they updated a lot of PS4 titles to support 60 FPS, but pretty much all of their PS5 titles and the PS4 titles that they could update easily enough already have that support, right? I mean, I guess they could add 60 FPS to the Until Dawn remaster remake thing.
Right.
Whoop-de-doo. Beyond that, though, my eye is mostly just on the boost mode stuff, just to see how that actually pans out.
I think if it is good and it is effective, then you will be leaning on developers to have had implemented unlocked frame rates in their prior games. So maybe it's more of a case where older titles that we did criticize at launch for having poor performance or for having unlocked frame rates on PS5 consoles that did not work out so well are ideally positioned for PS5 Pro enhancement, and less the case that the PS5 Pro will magically be able to take all those older titles to 60 FPS just somehow by removing those caps. I think you'll be depending on those developers to have, possibly to have bungled those versions in the first place.
Bungled, yes. All right, let's move on. Question here from Anxiously Chronoed Figured. We're going deep on CRTs, John.
Oh, no.
Hi, DF.
Yes.
Quick CRT question for John. Have you got all three main kinds of tubes at home? Shadow mask, slot mask, and aperture grill. Which one do you prefer? Or does it vary depending on the type of game you're playing? I find slot mask to be the sweet spot, but I know there's a lot of Trinitron fans out there who wouldn't trade their AGs for anything else. Cheers! Exclamation point. Can you explain what the difference is between these different types of tubes as it's presented here?
Okay, so essentially, when you think about the way a CRT works, you have the electron gun firing these electrons out of the neck of the thing, right? And so before it hits the actual phosphor screen inside, there's like a mechanism, like a physical, like in the Sony tubes, the aperture grill. There's literally like an aperture grill, like a metal grill that sort of funnels through the different RGB elements onto the screen. And this is how they create these individual dots, right? So it's like it's basically like an internal piece of metal or technique used to determine how these phosphors hit the screen and sort of split up the different colors from the RGB elements coming from the electron gun, I guess. That's my quick off the top of the head kind of summary thing there, but that's essentially what he's talking about. And the whole thing is from a modern perspective, here's the way to look at it. Think about the way subpixel arrangements work on LCDs and OLEDs and all that. And you know how that differs, right? There's like the old pentile layout and the different layouts of the different subpixels. That's kind of what you get with these different sort of masks and the aperture grill. It has an effect on how the red, green, and blue converge and display individual elements across a CRT screen. And I like the look of them all. I actually do have all of these here, though most of mine are Sony's, which means that they're largely aperture grill based, but I do have some others, JVC, the Bang & Olufsen, Toshiba, the kind of stuff around. So picking which one I like the best, though, that's the thing. It's a really difficult thing because they all can look really awesome depending on just like the tube quality and everything. There's a lot of elements that determine that. And it's not just the grill type. There's also like the amount of like, the line count, for instance, like a high line count CRT versus a low line count one, a monitor grade tube, a consumer Sony aperture grill based set versus say one of their high end BVMs. They're both aperture grill based, but the actual end result is extremely different in terms of what is drawn out to the screen. So there's image quality in terms of what you see visually on screen differs a lot between every CRT tube type. So when you just have like the quote unquote CRT filter in a game, right, there is no such thing as just like, this is what a CRT looks like. There's a lot of CRT types out there. So that's the thing to consider, which is neat. But like I said, I don't really have a specific preference for one over the other. It just varies on what I'm in the mood for and what the content is. And, sometimes I want the look of a nice slot mask versus an aperture grill, but I think they all look awesome in their own right.
Okay, fair enough. Let's move on. This question generated by Jensen Huang AI. Good morning, DF crew! Exclamation point. There have been a lot of conversations about what a new PlayStation or Xbox console would be like if it used an Nvidia GPU instead of an AMD GPU. What is the likelihood of something like that even happening? Nvidia doesn't have an x86 license, and game consoles moved away from separate CPU and GPU dies 2 console generations ago for cost and power savings. In addition, Both Microsoft and Sony have used Nvidia GPUs in their consoles at some point in the past, but seem to have shown no interest in doing so again. What would need to change for a theoretical Nvidia-powered PlayStation or Xbox to happen? Well, a lot of things, I think. Just quickly, moving to an ARM-based architecture would effectively remove the x86 requirement that's kind of present in the current generation machines. But beyond that, I think it is just a question of the type of deal that they could actually negotiate with Nvidia, who, to be fair, don't really need this kind of deal. They're already like hugely successful, whereas AMD, historically has needed that kind of deal. John, it's not really much like. I mean, we kind of wish it would happen simply because they've got the best features and a cutting edge silicon, but realistically, Nvidia in an Xbox or especially a PlayStation, less likely to happen, right?
Yeah, they've gone too far down the specific path, and I think things like backwards compatibility have become prioritized, and breaking that is not something that they want to do. And I believe that's exactly the kind of thing they would run into if they were to take sort of like the more ARM-based approach, like Nintendo did with the Switch, which is what you'd probably get if they went with Nvidia, right? So, even though it would be interesting to see, and I would like to see what would happen if they took this path, I just don't feel like it's all that likely unless they're willing to do more of a clean break or sacrifice this like just full backwards compatibility thing. Because I mean, they can't really do like the old method, right? Like backwards compatibility on PlayStation 2, for instance, or the early PS3s relied on additional bespoke hardware from the prior generation machines essentially being factored into the mainboard design. And realistically, you can't do that. That would be insane and expensive to have like an AMD SoC in there just to handle backwards compatibility or something, or like offload part of it to something like that. So, and I mean, I think, would you guys agree that backwards compatibility has become like a very important thing, especially in this digital age, and they probably don't want to break from that in any significant way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's entirely the case. And that's basically, well, Phil Spencer's on the record as basically saying they lost the only generation that really mattered, which was the Xbox One, PlayStation 4 era, where the concept of building a digital library became so important that, realistically, those people who had a sizable Xbox digital library moved on to Series S and X, and PlayStation, which had a much more sizable user base with digital libraries, moved on to PlayStation 5. So, yeah, basically, it's of crucial importance. So the concept of, and I think there was that, Oliver, correct me if I'm wrong, there was that news story recently that Intel were pitching for PlayStation 6.
Yes.
And eventually it was like, well, AMD just proved to be the more logical choice. Do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Yes, I think that story is quite relevant here because I think at the moment the calculus isn't quite there, which is evidenced by the fact that Sony was choosing between AMD and Intel and not Nvidia or Qualcomm or AMD or Intel, right? They were choosing between x86 manufacturers that would be able to presumably give them that x86 architecture and some level of backwards compatibility support. But I think here with some of the better ARM CPU designs, in particular Orion, that single core performance is finally there. So I think that like in the past, it would be tough for a home console project just because when you're looking at like potentially a Zen design versus a typical ARM Snapdragon chip that you could buy, or a typical ARM just a CPU license that you could get, it was not really competitive. Now it's more competitive, so that's more interesting. But I think, yeah, backwards compatibility is a key issue. And I think it's just a matter of risk, ultimately. Like, do you want to go with NVIDIA? Do you want to lose x86? Do you want to probably lose backwards compatibility? Do you maybe want to be losing even some CPU performance relative to what you could get on an AMD design or an Intel design? I think at the moment the calculus is probably not quite there, but I could see it in the future, depending on how things shake out. I could see that being different in 5 years and 10 years.
Yeah, we saw in the FTC leak that Microsoft were choosing, or at least considering, ARM-based CPUs for their next generation console. And that is pretty much the main thing, I think, compatibility-wise, that they would need to solve, moving from, a potential AMD-based SoC to Nvidia. But, I just think the way things are going at the moment, all of the things that question generated by Jensen Huang AI pointed out here, these guys have worked with Nvidia before and they've never gone back. So, yeah, I mean, we've got Nintendo now, which seems to be a pretty happy partnership, but it seems to be AMD all the way. Okay, let's take a look at this question. It's from Zero. Hey, gents, ! Off the wall theory I had this week with the existence of Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered. And looking at it, it certainly is an off the wall theory. What if PS6 isn't backwards compatible with the PS4? Beyond just padding out their release windows, what if Sony is engaging in future-proofing of their big hits because PS6 won't handle PS4 era titles natively? It could possibly explain some of their odd choices in titles to remaster. Love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for the stellar work! So, John, this is an off-the-wall theory because there's just no way in hell that a PlayStation 6 is not going to be compatible with PlayStation 5 and, by extension, PlayStation 4. What do you think of the off-the-wall theory and why are we getting these remasters? Because it's kind of odd, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't buy this theory at all. I suspect if it's going to be compatible with PS4, I'd be very surprised if it was not. As for why they're doing it, I mean, that is tricky. I assume, the resources required to do most of these is probably not that significant. So it's kind of an easy way to get more life out of these games on a newer platform. It also does indeed fill spots in the release schedule, since everyone seems to be struggling to get stuff out at a regular pace these days.
Yeah.
There is, like, for instance, The Last of Us Part 1, T-Loop 1, as Oliver would say. I think that was done to coincide with the HBO show, and clearly a lot of work was poured into that. It was massively overhauled, but most of the rest of these that we've seen, like the Ghost of Tsushima, for instance, it's just like, it's a mildly enhanced version of the game that just happens to natively run on PS5, and it's just like, yeah, I assume Horizon will be kind of similar to that as well. Although they do advertise quite a bit of changes, so we'll see how that goes. But I mean, if it's really tricky though, right? Like, it's hard for me to know for sure, like, what's actually driving these, other than they just want to bring it forward to a new audience, not unlike Nintendo did with Wii U to Switch, although in that case the Wii U was a massive failure, so it made sense to bring those forward, but still.
Oliver, I can't envisage a world that a PlayStation 6 would be compatible with PlayStation 5, but not PlayStation 4. And I think that if there was a compatibility issue with PlayStation 6, they would make the remasters for PlayStation 6, not PlayStation 5.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, like this commenter's name, the chances of this are zero, approximately zero. If you have PS5 BC, I really don't see why PS4 BC would be that much of a push there. But I mean, I think on the second question here, I think redoing the older games is probably just to fill out the release calendar at this point, because games take so long to develop. But I also think a critical aspect of it is trying to expand the audience for sequels, because those sequels are taking so much money to develop that maybe you do need to find an additional 2 million Last of Us fans or something out there to make a sequel viable, right? Or you do need to find, an extra few million Horizon fans out there to make Horizon 3 viable, right? That's probably just the case there. And that also ties in with all of Sony's various cross-media projects, including now, The Last of Us, God of War. I think there's a Horizon thing in development. I mean, they're really pulling out all the stops there. Until Dawn, obviously, they're doing a movie. They're trying to expand that audience base through remasters, remakes, cross-media partnerships to try to justify games with a $200 million or $300 million budget. That's what I suspect.
Fair enough. Let's move on. Interesting question here that I've included for reasons that will become apparent. It comes from Rich, not me. Any interest in the new ModRetro Chromatic for Game Boy games? It apparently plays original carts! ! Now, I included this question, John, because I recall at Gamescom this year, you actually saw the ModRetro Chromatic, right?
I did. I played it, and it's freaking awesome. I really like what they're doing. Now, it's kind of a little bit different from something like an Analog Pocket. It is very specifically focused on replicating the hardware function of a Game Boy Color. So it plays original Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. But what's fascinating about it is that they went through the pains of engineering a new screen for it. That's, it's a modern LCD. It's very bright, good viewing angles, everything. But it's the original Game Boy resolution. So it's like 160 by 144 pixels. And that didn't really exist. Like, there was no off-the-shelf screen that was made at that quality. That's just 160 by 144. So they actually went through the trouble of recreating that, and it works. It's different compared. So the Analog Pocket approach was to essentially increase the resolution by 10 times. So it's like 1600 by 1440 in a small screen. And then they generate sort of these like extremely faithful sort of patterns to replicate subpixel elements of these various screens. And that's also very effective. That also meant that they could use the FPGA core stuff to do other cores, right? Because you could do higher resolution games. Whereas here, anything that's beyond, like, you can't do anything beyond 160 by 144 without it looking super garbled. So this is very explicitly focused on just running these games from cartridges. But the build quality is really nice. It's a beautiful little device. It looks very reminiscent of a real Game Boy Color, but with its own sort of pastiche. The D-pad is excellent. It feels really good. The buttons are awesome. It's a really nice looking little piece of kit. And I have an interest in one for sure. I would like to look at that down the future, but it is very much like, if you have real carts and you want to play it, or you just have an EverDrive and you want to experience it with a screen that's like the correct resolution, this gets you there.
Any idea when it's actually coming? It's not out yet, is it?
I think it's coming fairly soon. I seem to recall by the end of this year, sometime in the next month or two. And not only that, they're actually producing new games. They're working with developers to create new indie games for Game Boy that will run on regular old Game Boy Color hardware, but also the new ModRetro. And it seems like they're going to sell like retail cartridges or packaged cartridges of these games. So basically helping produce new GB software, which again, that's really cool because the tools for developing Game Boy games have become widely available, like Game Boy Studio and various others, where it's now the bar to entry in terms of programming and creating stuff for the Game Boy is really low compared to where it used to be. So it's a chance to see new Game Boy software, which I always celebrate this.
Okay, good stuff. Let's move on. This new question comes from Daniel Bross. Hi guys! Exclamation point. I recently read an article on PC Gamer titled, There's a future where you and your graphics card decide what a game looks like, not the developers. Talking about how AI would be able to change the graphical style in a game to your liking instead of keeping the developer's vision. This way of thinking really worries me as a developer, and I was wondering what your thoughts are about this. Is this really what the players want? Now, Oliver, you keep a track of all of this AI stuff.
Yes.
It was a contentious article. What do you think of it?
It was. So I do have some thoughts on this. My first point is that it's really not likely to take this form or a form similar to this in the near future, because if you look at the processing requirements of video generation, AI video generation, they're extremely intense. The level of temporal cohesion is not really there. The level of resolution is not really there in terms of the detail that it's resolving. I think the much more likely thing that we're going to see with similar-ish technology is something more like DLSS ray reconstruction, possibly something that slots in as a post-process. So like you could imagine an AI trained on like indirect lighting, handling ambient occlusion in much the same way that we, currently inject ambient occlusion using tools like Reshade. That handles things like complex geometry well, has good temporal consistency, has some understanding of things that go off screen, for instance, possibly with this AI ambient occlusion technique that I'm just hypothesizing here. And in that context, with something that's a little bit more gradual and could possibly run in real time for a game, could possibly run with acceptable latency and could possibly actually operate in the context of a real-time renderer. Is it that much of an abrogation of the developer intent to improve lighting quality a bit or make these alterations to a game that aren't really that different from injecting SSAO or FXA into an older title? And of course, that original version of the game still exists. So I would really say that it's more likely to be in the direction of something much more gradual in the short term. I don't think we're going to see anything like this in the short term in real-time rendering. My second point is that even that more expansive AI overhaul that you might see at some point in the more distant future, to me, it does not seem like anything that's fundamentally that different from something like Doom Path Traced. And I guess the question is, do you see that as disrespectful? Like, do you think an id Software employee would look at that and say, that's really disrespectful and I'm upset at that concept? Or is it an interesting spin on an older title, right? That's kind of a difference of taste. And I think in the end, it is a matter of taste. And that PC Gamer article had somewhat less tasteful revisions to the artwork of BioShock Infinite, redoing it in a totally different style and not portraying it in such a faithful way, and also not looking that great. But if you did have something that's closer to that original art, that is more conservative, more tasteful, maybe actually uses the original concept art or digital illustrations or 3D CG content from a game like that, depending on the title, uses that as inputs to give it a closer match to that original vision. I know it's controversial in the here and now, but I could totally see that as something that we're looking at in 10 years and saying this is a normal part of life, of modifying older games. And of course, that older version of the game is still there. And I will admit, I did feature something quite similar to this using more primitive AI video generation technologies in a video about 1.5 years ago. But I did feel like that was a glimpse of a more distant future and not something that we'll see as a functional enhancement to games in the next few years. And ultimately, I do think like this, obviously this is very controversial, but I think it comes down to a matter of taste and how faithful you are being to that original title, and also how gradual you're being to that original title. Like I was looking at, there are modifications now, I guess, for a title like Metaphor ReFantasio that are trying to add TAA and things like that. Is, on some level you have to say, is this a failing of that original work, that maybe some of the lighting quality or some of the asset quality or things like this, that they were primitive at that time, or that there are technical problems in games? Like, to what extent is making modifications like this to try to overcome some of those areas, is that trying to violate the original artistic intent of the game, or is that just trying to improve it in a new and interesting way? I think that's probably a balance that people are going to have to strike. I think it's a hard thing to strike, especially with some of these technologies that might be quite powerful in the future. But for now, I don't really think it's in that category. So kind of a bit of a mixed answer there, but that's my overall perspective on it at the moment.
John, what do you think?
Wow, I don't really have much else to add to that, Oliver. That was beautifully covered. So, and I kind of agree. And it is, I think the current scenario that was played out isn't really feasible, as you suggested. And it's almost just like designed to be like a news post to like shock people and make them upset. Or it's like, look at this insane thing that you can do. AI is going to do this. It's like, no, that's not a thing, and it's not going to be a thing anytime soon. And even modifying visuals in any way, as you said, it's not that different from like injecting, sweet FX into your PC games or, these path tracing mods. It's just something to fiddle with, and it doesn't erase the original vision. So I think there's use for this stuff in there to mess with graphics. And as long as graphics have been rasterized or drawn onto computer screens, people have been messing with them and modding them and toying around with what's possible. And this is just another facet of that. It's just that what PC Gamer's trying to propose here is not really anything that I foresee anytime soon. And even then, I don't know. It's a weird situation. But yeah, Oliver got it right.
I do recall when Alex and I met with Tom Peterson from Intel to discuss Intel Arc, and we were talking about some of the potential applications of AI, the concept of essentially changing the style of a game's graphics did come up. But I do believe that you're probably right. It would be some sort of post-process or reshade style take on it. I don't think it would be something that should worry a developer as such, because, well, ultimately the developer is still required for the core visuals, right? It's just that, it's going to be a mod. I think, when I first saw this PC Gamer headline, I actually sort of, in my mind, just changed that headline to be there's a future where the games journalism that you read is going to be decided by an AI, not journalists. And that particular future is far more likely to happen than the graphics option that's being put down here. But, when it comes to making posts on X, basically, I self-edit about 95% of the things I want to say. Just in the end, just don't write it at all. but that's basically,
Yeah, I'd also come around to what we have today with Reshade. I can put in a couple of Reshade plugins and make any game look totally tasteless right now. Right?
Oh, yeah.
I can do that right now. Or I can do something more tasteful. I can add FXA, I can add SSAO. Maybe in the future we'll be talking about I'm running Sora Model 3 real time on this, and I'm using these as inputs, and here's the result I'm getting, versus here's the result I'm getting, versus I'm running the original game, but maybe I'm using RTX Remix 3 on it or something. I think this is probably going to be part of the future. And I think that probably at some point we'll come to accept this as a viable way to, to take a look at older games. And I think we are already with RTX Remix and with various post-process injections. I don't think it's that different categorically from what is being proposed here, although I do think the examples that he used were maybe a little bit inflammatory and possibly a little tasteless.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about Microsoft Auto SR, which is effectively a AI post-process on an existing game frame. And, the model there is about upscaling, but I'm curious as to whether the model could be, okay, I want an anime version of this frame. I think that probably we will be seeing stuff like that, but I don't think it's going to be as sort of destructive to developers in that sense as potentially other applications of AI. Let's move on. Final question. This one from SJ33 in brackets, Jake. Hi, Jake. I've just thought I'd get that out of the way. Anyway, the question is, hi all. 5800X3D, the GOAT, going to go down as a classic. Do you think AMD regret making it? I still don't feel a need to upgrade from my 5800X3D, even with the 9800X3D around the corner. Nobody should build an AM4 machine right now, but there's still not a huge reason to upgrade from AM4 to AM5 unless you absolutely have to have the best. Feels like it'll keep chugging along for at least another generation or so. So I think Jake is referring to the news this week that AMD is end-of-lifing the 5800X3D. And yeah, the question is, do AMD regret making it because it's humbled so many more of their later products? Oliver, curious about your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I don't think they do regret it, because the 5800X3D is such a successful piece of hardware. And indeed, even though they have discontinued or do seem to be discontinuing that line of hardware, the 5700X3D is extremely similar to the 5800X3D. And as far as I can tell, that's still broadly in stock. It's 4 or 5% faster typically in gaming workloads. You also have the 5600X3D, which is a 6-core variant that also has the 3D cache on it. That is also possibly a quite tantalizing upgrade for people on older hardware. I think this could be a situation like this commenter says, where kind of like the i5 2500K, where people just kind of stick with it for years and years and years because it delivers performance that is broadly acceptable relative to more modern processors. And even at the moment, I don't think that for gaming uses, there is a big reason to upgrade necessarily, even to something maybe like the 9800X3D, at least for gaming uses. Although I would say that for productivity uses, a 5800X3D relative to something like a 7950 or possibly a 9950, I think that is going to be lagging behind somewhat, depending on what your use case is, depending on how multi-threaded the workloads that you're looking at are. So it's not necessarily a processor that's going to be great for everyone. But yeah, I mean, personally, I think it's a great processor. I'm very much looking forward to the 9800X3D and the 9950X3D and all those X3D processors, which I think we'll know more about quite soon, because there are rumors of an event coming up in the next week or so. So hopefully that will be exciting. But for now, I think the 5800X3D is a very good chip. And I think that instead of running away from it, AMD is embracing it with some of these slightly lower cost, but very performant processors on the AM4 platform, like we've seen with the 5700X3D and the 5600X3D.
Yeah, John, I don't know what you think, but I think that if you put out a product that is essentially, a cost-efficient Halo product, it only enhances the reputation of the entire brand. So it's probably, I don't feel there's any regrets from AMD for doing this. I don't know what you think.
Precisely. I can't see any regrets in this. It's an amazing product that got people talking about AMD processors right as Intel was stumbling, right? So like maybe it's hard to match with a follow-up product right now, but that's usually what happens. It's the same with GPUs throughout history, right? You have those famous GPUs that hit that everyone gravitated to, like when the 8800 GT came out, for instance. It was a revelation. That certainly did not hurt the brand, right? Yeah. And it's the same thing here. But yeah, the CPU space is in a slightly weird position right now for sure, where updates feel extremely incremental and sometimes even step backs in certain ways, which has certainly left me questioning where I go next and when I even consider updating my own CPU. So it's just, it's weird right now on the CPU side.
Yeah, I mean, I've said it in the past and I'll say it again. The 5800X3D, I think, is one of the most consumer-friendly launches I've ever seen, in that it basically revitalized systems that went back like 5 years. It was just absolutely remarkable. And, the whole X3D concept has entirely caught Intel off guard because, essentially what it does is not only do you get this fantastic performance out of the box just through the V-cache, but it also helps reduce system cost overall, because there's not necessarily the need to actually invest in super fast system memory to go with it, which I think is pretty fantastic as well. So, I don't think there's any regrets there. I think it was a fantastic move from AMD, and it's kind of like the masterstroke in becoming the boss of the consumer CPU market.
The boss.
And, strictly speaking, in terms of the amount of money they make from the desktop CPU market, compared to like mobile and enterprise, it's actually surprisingly small. So, but the reputational impact of the X3D is just can't be understated. It's just fantastic. It's a shame to see it go, but, I don't think there's ever going to be a shortage of chips available if you want to buy one. And as Oliver says, the 5700X3D, which is essentially the same thing, is apparently still going. I mean, I just bought one from AliExpress for like £130, which is nuts considering the amount of performance you get. But yeah, that is it. That was the final question. Therefore, the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed it. On the off chance, ring the bell for messages may or may not appear. DF supporter program, though, that is important. Patreon.com/digitalfoundry. Support the team, get early access to DF Direct Weekly, the ability to help shape the show, early access to a whole bunch of materials, actually. So please do consider that. And of course, store.digitalfoundry.net for our merchandising wares. But that's all from us for this week. Thanks for watching.